Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Akhtar Afzal, and I'm the moderator for this session. I would welcome all of you to this session focused on the global economy. I am a professor of economics at Habib University in Karachi, and I also write for Dawn as well as for the Friday Times. So without further ado, I would just like to set the stage for our today's discussion. Lekin, before that, I have to introduce my panelists. So let me just quickly introduce my panelists here, and then I will set the stage, and then we will jump right into discussion. So my first panelist today is Mr. Asim Chauhan, who is joining us online today. He is currently serving as Senior Vice President at Morgan Stanley, a Fortune 100 leading Wall Street financial firm in the world. In the last 2 decades, he has managed global teams and organizations across Americas, Asia, and Europe. In May of 2022, Mr. Chauhan was honored and recognized for his leadership contributions by his firm and featured at their headquarters big screen at the Times Square in New York City. Mr. Chauhan holds a master's in information management from Webster University, bachelor's in computer science, and an associate diploma from the University of Cambridge. Mr. Asim Chauhan. Thank you. Second panelist for today is Dr. Hatia Majid, seated to my right. She is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Economics at LUMS. Her research agenda considers the impact of monetary and public resource constraints on individuals in Pakistan, with a special focus on women's access to decent, empowering work. A Fulbright scholar, she has a PhD from The Ohio State University and MS from the University of Warwick. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hatia Majid. Third panelist today is Dr. Ammar Malik, who is also joining us online. He's a senior research scientist at 8 Data, a research lab at the College of William & Mary. He also was previously the director of research for policy design, a research initiative of the Center of International Development at Harvard University. A proud alumnus of Beacon House, Dr. Malik holds a bachelor's in economics and math from LUMS, a dual master's in public policy and public affairs from National University of Singapore, Sciences Po in Paris, and PhD in public policy from George Mason University. Dr. Ammar Malik, ladies and gentlemen. And now, to last but not least, Dr. Mujtaba Paracha is a renowned civil servant who started his career in Balochistan more than 25 years ago and is currently serving as Pakistan's ambassador and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Dr. Paracha graduated from the London School of Economics and completed his doctorate from IDS, which is Institute for Development Studies at Sussex University. He recently published his book, Property Taxes and State Incapacity in Pakistan, which was awarded the Bloomsbury Pakistan Book Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Mujtaba Paracha. All right then, so having the introductions out of the way, I'm just going to take 5 minutes to set the stage for our very interesting discussion today. All right. So I would like to take all of you back to January of this year, as the world was coming out of COVID-19. And as the world was coming out of COVID-19, there arose a massive imbalance between this massive pent-up demand, because people had not been spending money, and problems when it comes to supply chain issues. And because of this gap, we started seeing an upward trend in prices all over the world. So inflation started rearing its ugly head in the Western world primarily. On top of all that, later, as hostilities started between Russia and Ukraine, this, um, this pattern of rising prices started becoming very, very steep and very significant. And all of a sudden, we realized, or at least people in the developed world realized, that inflation had reached a situation that had not been seen in the last 40 plus years. So this was a very, very urgent situation in the Western world. There was a commodities super cycle. The price of oil started spiking, and this situation led you to what happened in Sri Lanka. You know how Sri Lanka went through a default. And this is where Pakistan comes in. So 2 or 3 fateful weeks in April, you may remember, it seemed that Pakistan was also headed in the direction of Sri Lanka. Thankfully, that reality, that very unfortunate reality has not come to pass. But then, as luck would have it, Pakistan today is still reeling from the aftermath of the worst floods this country has ever seen. Going forward, ladies and gentlemen, going forward, I see 3 or 4 very strong headwinds or economic challenges. Number one has to be the politics surrounding OPEC and now OPEC plus. You know, when you include Russia into OPEC, with OPEC, it becomes OPEC plus. And how the price of oil is going to behave in the years to, in the months to come, that is going to determine both the economic situation in the world and also what happens in the case of Pakistan. I'm also concerned about recessionary issues in the United States and how that is going to impact Pakistan's exports. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I am losing sleep over so-called great power rivalry, as a new Cold War has started between the United States and China, and how a country like Pakistan that wants to maintain friendly relations with both of them, how are we going to negotiate in a world if hostilities start between these two great powers? My final comment before I turn over the mic to my first panelist today has to be, given these very immense economic challenges that we are facing as a nation, as an economy, do Pakistani policymakers see a path for themselves through October 2023? That is the date for general elections as we know it right now. There is a path, but that path is an incredibly narrow path. And this assumption that elections are going to be held in October of next year might just turn out to be a heroic assumption, the way ground realities on the political, in the political arena are changing. So I think with these words, I would just like to take the opportunity to invite my first speaker, Mr. Asim Chauhan, and ask him the following question. So Mr. Chauhan, thank you for joining us. My question to you today is, what is the impact of digital economy transformation on the future of the world economy? Why is the inclusive digital economy important for emerging markets like Pakistan? And finally, how can we effectively harness the digital economy for empowering youth, women, and underserved demographics? Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar, and thank you for inviting me here. The promise of digital new opportunities that has never been done before, and basically it's transforming how jobs are being created, how services are being delivered to financial, and it's making a very large impact into the global economic scale. Think about digital technology as a whole. By 2025, about 71 globally will have access to internet, and about 61% have access to mobile technology. So if we think from a global GDP perspective, perspective, digital serving right now about 16% of GDP, and by 2025, it's supposed to reach by 20. So in countries like Pakistan, GDP growth as it goes with it important. World Bank have estimated that an inclusive and affordable can increase your GDP by 2% every year globally, and that can reduce opportunities. So what we need to do in terms of focus areas is make sure that broadband internet connection, we're focusing on digital literacy, we're bringing sectors together, we're forming policies, spending money in research and innovation, sure that supports Pakistan into the digital economic world. About 2 billion people in the world, if you talk about purely from economic perspective, people that have no access to formal financial services, which means they don't have a checking account and they don't have access to loans and borrowing. Countries that have done really well in affordable digital economy, they have delivered policies at large. What is that? They have created digital universal IDs. Government is giving incentive to people to be. Imagine if you offer a few thousand rupees to people, how many people will go and open an account in this country? Have fully supported innovation, whether it's in different sectors. They have models that's enabling e-commerce and artificial intelligence. Basically, for digital economy, we need to have what is known as a national financial inclusion bias that brings different sectors and different players together, financial regulators, their education ministries, telecommunication, people who create so that we can have a universal strategy to tackle financial inclusion. Specifically talking about financial industry, there has been a lot of research years which make sure which kind of emphasize the point that if you have an inclusive and you have a diverse workforce, that really helps people grow their business and they can avail more opportunities. If you think about, if you talk about a little bit about what do people want, whether you're in a personal setting or in a professional setting, they want to feel respected, valued, engaged, and safe. For inclusive and safety is not only physical safety, but it's also about mental safety. People don't harassment, bullying, verbal abuse, or any kind of derogatory valued and listen, which is very important as we go towards the future economy. The digital economy can only be successful if we have environment. We want to make sure that we're providing mentoring, guidance, and advocacy from all to the people who want equitable opportunities, and that includes youth, women, people who are sick, disabled, that we give them equitable opportunities so they can all develop, grow, and how can this be done? We can do an analysis of a baseline. We can look at barriers, we can look at what are the barriers for opportunities, and then set the right target. How long are we tolerated? What is expected? And make sure we create the linkage of business opportunity needed to bring a diverse workforce together and do it at the C level with executives to bring in all the recruiting policies and procedures together. So, just an estimate is out there that 70% of new value creation in the next be based on digitally enabled platform business model. The digital economy great in future. If you think of Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, virtual blockchains, self-driving cars, you name it. So we need to make sure that we're bringing sector, the public sector together. We're focusing on education, society, and community to be able to bring an inclusive, incredible digital economy to our population. If you some of the future actions that we need to take, that we can take, we have to close the digital divide. We know there's a digital Pakistan and other countries between man and woman when it comes to usage of mobile. We know there's a divide between large cities and small towns in terms of affordable internet. We know there's a divide between younger and older generation when it comes to use services. So we need to make sure we close this divide. We prepare for the jobs of tomorrow, reliable infrastructure, so digital economy can be supported fully, and lastly, that we educate our youths for technology and innovation for tomorrow, teachers, because if the teachers are trained in the right way and they know what is coming, they will be mission on to their youth, and that way we will be looking for a better future. And thank you, Dr. Agdas.
Thank you very much for being so educative, concise, and thank you most of all for being on time with your comments. Thank you so much. Now, I am going to move to my next panelist, Dr. Hadia Majid, and I'm going to ask her to please tell us, how do we harness women's work to realize a better future in the global economy? And while you're trying to answer that question, I'm also going to ask you, what enabling conditions do we need for women to work? How do we reimagine women's contributions to the economy?
Thank you, Dr. Agdas. And thank you to the organizers. This has really been a fantastic conference. I'm going to be building on a few of the points that Mr. Asim has already talked about. I think to aapne preamble diya, it's been fantastic. It's really put things in perspective. And I think a lot of what I'm going to say today really speaks to some of the recessionary pressures that you talked about right in the beginning. So I'm going to be focusing my comments mostly on women's work and female labor force participation. So isme Pakistan, as most of you know, is one of the worst performers. We have one of the lowest levels of women's labor force participation rates. But even if you look at this globally, globally there are estimated GDP losses of about 20 to 30%, depending on which region you're looking at. So if we can just get women's work properly harnessed, as you put it, it would help improve GDP by up to a third in economies like ours, where women's work is really not at the level where we want it to be. So I've focused the first part of my comments on how do we get women to work, where should we be intervening, but I also want us to give some food for thought towards the end, where I just want us to think a little bit about maybe we're going about this in the wrong way, and maybe we need to broaden our imagination when it comes to thinking about women's work. So अगर आप policy interventions के बारे में सोचें तो बहुत सारी policy interventions हैं. There are role model effects that people discuss. There is the idea of safer public transport. Isme the idea is that there is a supply side issue. So women are not entering the labor market because उनके लिए transport available नहीं है. They can't imagine themselves working. They're not seeing the role models that they need to in different fields. So they really think of themselves in a very narrow sense. इसमें आप what we want to do by having safer transport, by thinking about the work environment itself, is make it normalize it for women to come into the public space, normalize it for women to really be going out into the world working, so to speak. And of course, isme one of the reasons why women choose to not work, women may be opting out of work, is because the work environment, as we know, is quite hostile. Pakistan is a great case in this. By great, I mean it's a very apt example how hostile the working place can be, and जो ये अफोर्ड कर सकती हैं कि वो वर्क प्लेस में जाएँ ही ना, क्योंकि वर्क प्लेस इतनी हॉस्टाइल है, वो फिर ऑप्ट आउट कर जाती हैं. फिर डिमांड साइड की तरफ अगर आप आएँ कि ये सोचते अगर इफ़ यू स्टार्ट थिंकिंग अबाउट कि वाई इज़ इन देयर डिमांड फॉर वुमेन, वाई सर्टन जॉब्स में आपका पहला जो रुझान होता है वो यही होता है कि अच्छा वील गेट सम मैन टू वर्क. उसमें you start thinking about education, the education that women have, the training that they have. They're just not able to be trained at that level or have that high education level which the labor market may actually be requiring. So Here, I want us to think a little bit about the complementary markets that are in place to the labor market. So the education market is really important. There may be discrimination in the education market, which is then spilling over into the labor market. What I also want us to think about is the technology that Asim Saab talked about. Women in Pakistan don't have access to the kind of technology that men do. So we are one of the worst performers when it comes to the gender gap. We have a 33% gender gap in mobile ownership. We have a 38% gender gap in mobile internet usage. Women not only have lack the access to technology, when it comes to the use of technology, it's very controlled and it's very monitored. So in the post-pandemic world, where so much of our work has moved online, where people are realizing the important role that technology has as a complement to the labor markets, you realize that there's a large segment of the population, and this is true for both Pakistan and globally as well, which just does not have that kind of access to technology to complement the work that they can do in the labor market. Here I want us to think a little bit about the credit market too. Now, Pakistan is one of those countries जहाँ पे microfinance में आपको औरतें बहुत नज़र आएंगी कि वो they are the go-to population when it comes to microfinance institutions. वो इसलिए है क्योंकि women are known to be कि वो अपने जो loans हैं वो बहुत अच्छी तरह repay करती हैं. लेकिन जब आप उनके businesses को गौर से देखना शुरू करते हैं, they don't have that kind of productivity that the men's businesses do. अब अगर आप एक हाउस होल्ड के तौर पे सोचेंगे, द हाउस होल्ड व्हेन इज गेटिंग access to credit, it will be putting that credit to that place जहाँ पे सबसे ज़्यादा productive use होगा, जो कि inevitably मर्दों का business होता है. So why is it that women's businesses, women-led enterprises are just not able to achieve that level of productivity that men's businesses do? इसमें जो है networks का बहुत ज़्यादा important role है. मेन के पास वो ब्रॉड नेटवर्क है एंड उसमें आप टेक्नोलॉजी को ले लें, उनके जो दे गोइंग इनटू द पब्लिक स्पेस, दे टॉकिंग टू लॉट मोर इंडिविजुअल्स ऑफ डिफरेंट बैकग्राउंड्स, so they're able to see that level of productivity, that level of efficiency that women's businesses just are not able to. So my comments so far have thought, I've thought about work in the context of the formal sector, jahan pe demand of women is lower because they don't have that level of educational achievement. I've thought about it in terms of how are women getting to work. Maybe it's the fact that they can't get to work, that the work itself is not that safe, that you're not seeing women's labor force participation at the rate that we are. And then if you start moving even to other types of work, aap मार्केट जॉब्स ना सोचें, आप बिजनेसेस के बारे में सोच लें, तो उसमें भी women का उस लेवल ऑफ वर्क हो ही नहीं पा रहा है. Now I want to spend the last, I think I have about 5 minutes just thinking about कि अच्छा maybe we need to think little differently about women's work. Now इसमें I'll bring your attention to two things. एक है the informal market and दूसरा is what I call or what is called the care economy or reproductive work. So when we think about women's work, we tend to focus more on productive work. When we think about women in Pakistan, the kind of labor market work that they're doing, we normally think of work कि अच्छा आप औरतों को जो है कोई vocational training करवा दें और उनको जो है इस तरह से अपने labor market में ले आएं. We don't think about कि what are the high value added chains that women need to be a part of. We want to get them into the labor market, but what type of work do we want them to really do? And the reason why this is so important is because the nature of work that women do has a direct relation, of course, to their earning power and the earning capacities, but also all of these various spillover effects that we hope come out of work, earned income. अगर औरतें जो हैं वो अच्छा काम कर रही हैं, हाई वैल्यू एडेड चेन्स में हैं, तो उनका एक तो अर्न इनकम भी ज़्यादा होगा, लेकिन उसके अलावा जो आपके घरों पे इम्पैक्ट आता है, औरतों की घर में स्टेटस जो होता है, their ability to have a say in children's decisions, that increases. अब जनरली स्पीकिंग आप पाकिस्तान के लेबर मार्केट को अगर देख रहे हैं और आप विमेन की कंट्रीब्यूशन इन प्रोडक्टिव इकोनॉमी जब मेजर कर रहे हैं तो वो आपको बहुत कम नज़र आ रही है. One of the reasons why it's so low, and this is true for Pakistan as well as economies in Africa, is because there's a large segment of the labor market जहाँ पे हम उस तरह से measure कर ही नहीं पा रहे हैं, जो कि हमें वाकई में उनकी contribution दिखाएगी. वो आपका informal market है. So about in excess of 70% of all work in Pakistan's non-agricultural sector is accounted for by the informal economy. इसमें जो आपके main contributors हैं वो ख़वातीन हैं. अब इनफॉर्मल इकोनॉमी में आपके डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स आ गए, आपके होम बेस्ड वर्कर्स आ गए, आपका नॉन एग्री जो छोटे मोटे काम हो रहे हैं, जो घर पे बैठ के काम हो रहे हैं, वो आ जाते हैं। और उसमें औरतें बहुत ज़्यादा कंट्रीब्यूट करती हैं और वो हम मेजर नहीं कर पाते हैं। उसमें इकोनॉमिस्ट का मसला है, वी जस्ट डोंट हैव दोस काइंड ऑफ इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स दैट वी कैन रियली मेजर देम सो वेल. आई एम आउट ऑफ टाइम, आई थिंक. But the other thing that I would just want to say at the end is one other place where we fail as economists and as social scientists is we don't measure the care work that women do. Women are actually contributing a great deal to the economy because they take care of our next generation. And we just are unable to really think about how they are contributing to the economy through their reproductive work. And usme phir, when because we're not measuring it, we don't really understand कि उसकी उनकी किस level of contribution है. So that's an optimistic note that I have at the end. Maybe recessionary pressures aren't as high as we think they are. Maybe we're not performing as badly as we think we are. If we just were able to measure things a little bit better.
Thank you so much for that really comprehensive analysis that you've put forth. Since I'm the moderator, I am going to just say two things very quickly. And, this just came to me as I was listening to your very interesting comments on the subject. So I'm also a professor. I teach at Habib University in Karachi. And, there is a great majority of women students in university, yet that is not translating into women's higher participation in the labor force. And I think we really need to sit down and think about why that is happening. And this is where your work comes in and your reference to microfinance. I don't know if you remember or no, but back in the day, you and I were colleagues at LUMS 15 years ago. And I did write a very interesting research note for this bulletin that used to come out of the economics department. And what we have seen in the microfinance sector is that a lot of these women serve as mere pipeliners for funds. So the funds eventually go to the men in the family. And the final point that I want to make, and I think is a very interesting point, at least I think so, has to do with, all these things that you've talked about, the hurdles that women face when it comes to working conditions or finding a decent job, and our inability to do anything about our population growth rate and how the two are connected. And I don't want to talk further about that. I think that's a topic for another setting. But I think there are a lot of connections here as well. So thank you for those amazing comments once again. And I think this would be a perfect time to move to my third speaker, who is Dr. Ammar Malik. And I'm going to put to him a slightly different question. And I'm going to ask him that in the wake of the global economic slowdown, rising commodity prices, increasing interest rates, developing countries like Pakistan face a key conundrum. On the one hand, they require more public infrastructure to accelerate economic growth, while on the other, they are facing unsustainable levels of debt that is being created at a very alarming pace, akin or similar to the global debt crisis in the 1980s, given what we saw in Sri Lanka. And this ties back to the introductory comments that I was giving. Given what we have seen in Sri Lanka recently, where a sovereign debt default led to massive political upheaval, what can the global community do to manage these competing needs across the developing world? Over to you, Dr. Malik.
Thank you very much. The way I see the current situation, the biggest worry I have is that the gap between rich and poor countries, Pakistan being in the second part of this, is increasing. COVID did not help. Obviously, the food crisis is also hurting it, rising prices of fuel, which is essential for a lot of developing economies, is great. If I look at the global picture, I see that according to the G20, the infrastructure gap, which is the gap between the financing needs of countries and where they currently are, in the next 20 years, we need about $15 trillion of investments in public infrastructure in the world. Pakistan's infrastructure gap is $124 billion. And if you look at the breakdown of where the big infrastructure investments are needed, it is in sectors like energy, telecommunications, and highways and transportation. These are essential things that poor countries need to grow their economies. And if you don't continue to make those investments, then within those countries, the gap between the rich and poor will increase. Businesses will not be able to grow. Export competitiveness will go down, and there will be negative consequences all around. But having said that, a lot of poor countries, including our own, do not have the liquidity or the ability to make these investments on their own. We tend to loan money from external borrowers, and we've done it throughout our history. And in principle, there's nothing wrong with that. However, what has happened in the last few years is that if you look at the latest IMF statistics and focus on the low and middle income countries, 41 countries, according to the IMF, which are all in developing world, are in so-called debt distress. And the proportion of countries that are in debt distress has actually doubled. This is the most worrying thing. So in 2015, 30% of countries were in debt distress around the world. Today, it is 60%, which means the majority of the world is in debt distress, which means they will not be able to take on more loans, and they are having trouble repaying their existing loans. You talked about Sri Lanka. We saw a crisis in Zambia. Nigeria is in trouble. Pakistan has its own challenges. And I think the challenge is, how will we create a sustainable model in which these countries can take loans, but also repay them on time and also grow their economies? It's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, because you need the power and the connectivity to grow your economy. When the economy grows, you make more money, and then you can repay those loans. But somehow that cycle keeps breaking. If you look at the world and how money is given to developing countries for public infrastructure, one astonishing thing has happened in the last 20 years, which is, in short, the rise of China. Akhtas talked about that. The proportion of financing that was coming out of China, according to the World Bank and IMF estimates, in 2006, only 2% of the debt levels related to public infrastructure in developing countries was from China. Today, that has increased to nearly 18%. China is now the world's largest creditor. It is larger than the World Bank, the IMF, and all bilateral creditors combined. The size of China's overseas financial investments in official sector financing since 2000, according to estimates at aid data, is about $1 trillion. And yes, Pakistan has been one of the biggest recipients of US assistance over the years. But if you look at the global picture right now, China is outspending the United States by a more than 2-to-1 margin. It is outspending Brussels by a more than 8-to-1 margin, and the UK with a similar margin, which means that the global picture is such that China is now the world's largest debt collector, and there has to be some ways in the global system to incorporate China into the picture. China has consistently not been part of the Paris Club, which is the club of rich creditors that were participating in earlier debt crises and giving debt relief together. China wants to negotiate on its own terms. They do not participate in the international system, so to speak. However, we have seen recently that in the case of Zambia, when it was realized by the Western creditors that 60% of Zambia's debt was owed to China, they said that we cannot come to the table and together renegotiate Zambia's debt unless we had Chinese creditors on the table as well. And for the first time, to my knowledge, they overcame that barrier, and China came to the table, and they together worked out a deal in which all the creditors took a haircut, and now Zambia is on a more sustainable trajectory. So I think that as we saw recently when Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif went to Beijing, Pakistan is also seeking some debt relief from China. It is not going to be a restructuring. It's simply going to be a rollover or short-term balance of payment loans that we had taken, which is some relief. But some of the biggest money that we have received from China is in the energy sector, as well as in the highways and infrastructure sector. It is yet to be seen what kind of model the world can create, given the hostilities between the US and China, that will put us on a sustainable path where both sides can work together and resolve this growing debt crisis. Some of the big worries, and I'm going to wrap it up in a minute, some of the big worries I have is that China's Belt and Road Initiative, as large and mighty as it might be, is not going as well as they would have thought. Part of that reason is debt, but there's also other issues, including environmental concerns that have been raised, as well as social concerns about whether, to some of Hadia's points, whether women and men equally benefit from some of those infrastructure projects that are being constructed. According to Aid Data's estimate, about 35% of China's Belt and Road projects are having some sort of implementation challenges, and reports are that Beijing is considering a so-called BRI 2.0, which is a future in which China will not be lending in big-ticket infrastructure projects, and it will be much more likely to partner with Western institutions like the World Bank and the IFC to create syndicates so that they can hedge their bets against challenges that I have alluded to earlier. And the final thing I would say is that the world leaders from today are gathering in Sharm el-Sheikh to talk about climate justice. Pakistan is going to be a central player in that. The global south has seen a rise in climate-related crises, and it is obvious that the carbon emissions coming out of developing countries, developed countries in the West is having an impact on poorer countries. So there is now a conversation happening about including climate into the debt discussion and seeing if countries who are more at climate risk, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, whether they can be given some debt relief on account of their climate challenges. It is yet to be seen whether a big deal can be reached in Sharm el-Sheikh. I'm skeptical, but the conversations are going on, and we'll have to see what happens. Thank you.
Great. Those were amazing analysis. Very interesting comments about the kind of financing needs developing countries are going to have for the next 15 years. And the figures that you have quoted, especially for Pakistan, 124 billion, I mean, it's indeed staggering. Debt relief, of course, countries like Pakistan that are suffering because of climate change, there should be some grounds for providing debt relief, because similar initiatives have been done for various other countries. One is reminded of the London Debt Agreement of 1953, when 50% of Germany's external loans were written off, and the remainder was turned into very easy payments that they paid over the next 50 years. And the interesting thing is that one of the 20 countries that wrote off Germany's debt in 1953, one of those countries was Pakistan. Anyways, with these very somber conclusions that we are drawing from these remarks, I would like to now move towards my last speaker, Dr. Mujtaba Paracha. I would like to ask you, from your formidable experience at the World Trade Organization, how do you gauge our collective capacity to deal with various global challenges that we have been talking about in this session? And what are the lessons for Pakistan from your experience of working as the ambassador and permanent representative at WTO? Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Agdas, and thank you for the institution to invite me to this thought-provoking sort of session. So I'm just going to make 2 or 3 main points and try to sort of walk you through a couple of experiences that we've had. I've been at the World Trade Organization for 3 years now, representing Pakistan. The World Trade Organization is not a financial institution. It's a trade organization which is a successor of GATT, which makes rules on international trade, does some dispute settlement, and does another function, which is trade policy review. So it's really an international trade rule-making body. So the 3 points that I wanted to make boldly are in one-liners, that globalization is not linear. It doesn't go on happening. It can unhappen and then start happening again. So there can be sort of to and fro on globalization. Secondly, that the global institutions which we have now are largely post-World War II, built by certain countries who came first in the World War, and they built a world order according to their vision. So these institutions are not prepared for the challenge, to address the challenges that we face now, and I come back to what those challenges are. Thirdly, that there is no alternative to a strong domestic policy, not just one, but multiple policies on some or all issues that face countries and even at what we face at a collective global level. So I'll come back to that again. So just to stay succinct, I mean, the global challenges, and this, I'm sure in this sort of conference, you've had, it's called Guardians of the Future. The single most, and it's been alluded to by the last speaker, the single most, the largest and the biggest crisis that the world faces today is climate change. And you've had a trailer of it. We've had a trailer of it the last few months on what climate change can do. It's something that people are waking up to. Pakistan being one of the smallest carbon footprinters, less than 1% of the global emissions, is one of the top 10 most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change. So let that sink into you. It's something that you have not done, that you will pay for. The kinds of floods that have happened, and luckily we didn't have floods in our eastern rivers. We just had a flood in the Western River, Kabul in the Indus, and then localized rains, and 1/3 of the country was in water. God forbid, if you at the same time had flooding and a lot of rainfall on the side of Kashmir, catchment areas on the east, and the 4 rivers were flooded as well. You can just imagine what would happen. This is going to perhaps, it's as the world now misses apparently the 1.5 centigrade target in terms of mitigation. It's imminent that it'll miss it. You can imagine what the crop patterns would look like, what the crop failures would look like, and what the flooding would do to your productive capacity, not just the human disaster, the education, the health, the human loss. Okay, your productive capacity, and we are primarily, even now, although 1/3 is agriculture, but half your labor force is directly or indirectly, half the population is dependent on agriculture. So the challenge is being climate, and then the kind of black swan things like the pandemic that took place. I mean, that's something which is, they say once in a lifetime, but who knows how long when is the next one. Debt and rising inequality, not between just countries, but within countries, is another challenge that manifests itself in election results, like the swing to the right wing in Europe, US, the whole Trump effect, the swing to the left in Latin American elections recently. So it has manifestations in various ways for different reasons in different countries, and what the reasons are perceived by people or sold by political parties. And of course, global politics and wars, they give you shocks, supply-side shocks, that result in some of these challenges that emanate. So why do I think that global institutions are not well prepared? And I'll give the example of the WTO, and I will couch my example in what I've been putting out at the WTO, that if you have, and there are 2 economists sitting here, they'll back me up on this. If you have a global commons problem, then a commons problem is they normally give an example of a prisoner's dilemma. And they say that a commons problem can only be solved through a cooperative approach, not through a competitive approach. So unless the players in the game cooperate with each other, they will not reach an optimal outcome. And global issues like the pandemic was a global issue. The climate change is a global issue. So unless the players, meaning nation states, private corporations, people, but primarily the nation states, unless they cooperate, they will not come to the best solution possible. In the pandemic and at the WTO, and most of you here would know what the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement at the WTO is. It's I think my time is over, but very quickly. It gives you patent rights, right, to be implemented. So we wanted to get a waiver on that and fought for 2 years to get that waiver. It did not happen. Large countries, the rich countries, preferred profits over people's lives, and I'll leave it at that. So the climate change, same game, it's not going to happen. These institutions are not going to come through. What Pakistan can do very quickly on this, and we can come back to some of these things when we talk about, is exactly what has been spoken about is technology, human development, women inclusion into the workforce, increasing productivity, not being self-sufficient because you're living in a global economy, everybody cannot be self-sufficient, but you can be self-reliant in, especially in your food. Trade doesn't address that because we saw in vaccines countries who talk big, countries, I'll not name them, they bought vaccines in a free trade, free market economy. They bought vaccines 9 times their population, while developing or poor countries had no vaccines. When vaccines were about to expire, they donated them. So you need to put your own house in order, put policies in place, and try to improve as much as possible. Rolling from one IMF program to the other, debt, how do you get rid of debt, how to get debt forgiveness, this, that. At the end of the day, we'll have to learn to live within our means, and that to increase the means. And on taxation, the lowest tax to GDP ratio in the world probably, maybe just above Afghanistan, is Pakistan.
Okay.
So unless you fix that, you're not going to fix
thank
much.
you. Thank you very much. Great comments there. अच्छा जी, अब कुछ लोग मुझे कह रहे हैं कि वो क्वेश्चन पूछना चाह रहे हैं, लेकिन ये है कि हमें कुछ क्वेश्चंस पहले से दिए गए हैं, तो अगर उसके बाद वक्त मिला तो जैसे वाजिद साहब ने रिक्वेस्ट की है तो ज़रूर माइक आप तक आएगा. मैं पहले एक तो क्वेश्चन ले लूँ, उसके बाद आपके पास मैं आता हूँ, क्योंकि मुझे प्रॉम्प्ट किया जा रहा है टू एक पहला क्वेश्चन है मेरे पास कि एज इकोनॉमिस्ट्स what would you propose as essential economic learning for students so they are better prepared for the future? तो मैं ये question, since I'm the all powerful moderator, मैं ये direct करूँगा हमारे साथ जो डॉक्टर अमार मलिक हैं online, if he can just quickly try to answer this question. बल्कि एक मिनट सबसे एक सेंटेंस सबसे ले लेंगे इसके ऊपर. जी अमार मलिक से शुरू करते हैं. अमार साहब.
मेरे ख्याल में हमारे तालीमी निज़ाम में बेसिक इकोनॉमिक्स, माइक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स और मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स के एक कोर्स लाजमन पढ़ाना चाहिए. जैसे आज के पैनल में भी आपने देखा, हादिया वाज टॉकिंग अबाउट माइक्रो एंड आई वाज टॉकिंग अबाउट मैक्रो एंड हाउ इट कनेक्ट्स. आई थिंक दिस इज एसेंशियल फॉर एनी पाकिस्तानी सिटीजन, बिकॉज हम लोग वोट करते हैं और हमें इन चीज़ों का पता होना चाहिए.
इसका मतलब है कि इकोनॉमिस्ट को हमेशा जॉब्स मिलती रहेंगी अगर सब ने पढ़ना है तो. दैट्स अ गुड वन दो. अच्छी चीज़ है ये. मुझे पसंद आया आपका जवाब बहुत. अच्छा, मैं अब चौहान साहब के पास जाता हूँ, उनसे पूछता हूँ बड़ी जल्दी अगर बताएं, हाउ वुड ही रिस्पॉन्ड टू दिस.
So I think just building upon what Dr. Amar said, किसी भी तरह की इम्पोर्टेंट होती है. आप इकोनॉमिक्स से शुरू करें, आप इकोनॉमिक्स घर से सिखाना शुरू करें. बच्चों को फ्री में नहीं मिलता, कैसे उसको यूज़ करना चाहिए, कैसे उसको सेव करना चाहिए. Also बच्चे सपोर्ट करना चाहिए when they want to learn about innovation technologies rather than traditional rate if you want to make them that. लेकिन I think थोड़ी बहुत ये भी हमें करनी चाहिए.
चलें ग्रेट. आपने फोकस किया इनोवेशन टेक्नोलॉजी पे, बहुत खूब. मैं जाता हूँ अब हादिया के पास और उसके बाद डॉक्टर मुश्तबा पराचा के पास फॉर अ क्विक answer to that question.
So I wouldn't disagree with what's been said so far. What I would just add is, I think, and Johan Saab talks about this, digital literacy is really key for the future. Yeah.
अच्छा, चलें डॉक्टर साहब आप बताइएगा.
So I'm not an economist, But I think one big lesson it would be for students is that there's no free lunch. Everything that you do has a cost, and everything that you don't do also has a cost. So beware of both.
बहुत ज़बरदस्त आपने जवाब दिया. अच्छा जी, अब मेरे पास नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन फ्लैश हो रहा है और उसमें कहा जा रहा है कि क्वेश्चन इस तरह से है कि वुड इट बी पॉसिबल टू हैव ऑयल बीइंग ट्रेडेड एंड बॉट इन करेंसी अदर देन यूएस डॉलर. देखिए, मैं इसका जवाब देने की कोशिश करता हूँ. ये अगर सेलर्स एग्री कर जाएं कि वो ऑयल को यूएस डॉलर के अलावा किसी और करेंसी में बेचना चाह रहे हैं तो ऑफ कोर्स इट्स पॉसिबल. बट ऑयल की जितनी भी ट्रेडिंग है दुनिया में वो डॉलर के इन टर्म्स में होती है. तो आइडियली यस, इट्स पॉसिबल कि अगर सऊदी अरेबिया और पाकिस्तान के दरमियान कोई बार्टर एग्रीमेंट हो जाता है या वो हमसे गंदम ले लेते हैं या व्हाट हैव यू, लेकिन आई थिंक शॉर्ट ऑफ आई डोंट सी मोर chances or probability of that happening given कि दुनिया में ऑयल की डिमांड कितनी ज़्यादा है. तो मुझे ये ऐसा लगता नहीं है कि ये ऐसा होगा.
जिस तरह लाइक हमारे एक गांव में कहते हैं जिसकी लाठी उसकी भैंस. World politics is not any different. So politics leads economics, although economists would like to think the other way. But the fact that Russia attacked a country in Europe, despite selling all their natural resources to Europe, it has broken a big myth. कि आप trade build करें तो peace हो जाएगा. It didn't happen in a big way. The Chinese feel that there is a decoupling happening, and it's not fair. इस पे 5G पे पाबंदियाँ लगाई, उनकी कुछ कंपनीज पे पाबंदियाँ लगाई, चिप मेकर्स के ऊपर पाबंदियाँ लगाई. A lot of these get challenged at the WTO. The only enforcing mechanism of a WTO is कि आप उनके ऊपर retaliatory duties लगा दें. वो किसी उसको force नहीं कर सकते मुल्क को कुछ करने के लिए पैनल. But you know, the US has done something very interesting. एक हमारा एक function out of 3 is the dispute settlement mechanism, जिसका एक फर्स्ट लेवल है एडजुडिकेशन का और एक सेकंड टियर है अपील्स का, जिसमें 3 एपेलेट, इट्स नॉट मतलब कोर्ट तो नहीं है, वो एपेलेट बॉडी. जब 3 रिटायर हुए एपेलेट बॉडी के मेंबर्स लास्ट टाइम, तो यूएस हैज स्टॉल्ड और स्टॉप्ड अपॉइंटमेंट ऑफ न्यू पीपल because they are a powerful trading nation, and so they're not, because WTO में हर चीज़ consensus से चलती है. So small countries cannot stop something from happening. They cannot break a consensus, but a big country can. So yes, the Chinese might do the same thing. So it will again lead to deglobalization rather than getting one of them to change their behavior.
बहुत आपने अच्छा मुफस्सल सवाल. मेरे ख्याल में अगर कोई और मेरे पास क्वेश्चंस आ रहे हैं, नहीं मैं एक सेकंड सर, मैं ये क्वेश्चन लेता हूँ और अगर हमारे पास उसके बाद टाइम होगा तो यस डेफिनेटली आई विल कम टू यू. मेरे पास अगला जो क्वेश्चन आ रहा है वो आ रहा है कि कंसिडरिंग ग्लोबलाइजेशन एट इट्स पीक, डू यू थिंक दिस इज़ अ मैकेनिज्म और अ मेथड यूज्ड बाय कंट्रीज लाइक चाइना टू टेक ओवर द इकोनॉमिक सिस्टम ग्लोबली? अच्छा, मैं इससे ये समझ रहा हूँ कि पूछा जा रहा है कि ग्लोबलाइजेशन एक ऐसा सिस्टम है दैट इज़ बीइंग यूज्ड बाय चाइना टू टेक ओवर द इकोनॉमिक सिस्टम ग्लोबली. मैं तो अब ये समझ रहा हूँ, मुझे जो समझ आ रहा है, और मैं आपकी तरफ आऊँगा डॉक्टर हादिया कि आप इसका जवाब दें. मुझे तो ऐसे लग रहा है कि दुनिया अब ग्लोबलाइजेशन से डी ग्लोबलाइजेशन की तरफ जा रही है, जिसका एग्जांपल अभी वाजिद साहब ने भी दिया और डॉक्टर मुश्तबा पराचा ने भी जिसके ऊपर बात की. तो वी आर एंटरिंग इनटू अनचार्टेड टेरिटरी, और रादर द टाइम पीरियड बिटवीन द 2 वर्ल्ड वॉर्स, जब डी ग्लोबलाइजेशन और कॉन्टेस्ट वॉज एट इट्स पीक. तो आप इसको कैसे देखती हैं?
So I think all nation states will try and make sure कि उनका जो share of resources है वो build हो. And every nation से, जैसे डॉक्टर मुश्तबा ने भी कहा, we have to do self-reliance. Self-sufficiency is something that no nation state is capable of in this day and age. Or self-reliance is something that all nation states really owe to themselves. So अब चाइना तो यही चाहेगा कि उनके पास जितनी रिसोर्सेज हो सके वो उनको मैक्सिमाइज़ करें. अब हमारे ऊपर है कि हम उसको किस तरह से पुश बैक कर सकते हैं. एंड आई थिंक इसमें जो अम्मार ने स्टैट्स प्रेजेंट किए हैं, दे रियली आई ओपनिंग. चाइना इज़ इन दैट पोजिशन कि वो दे आर द लार्जेस्ट they have the largest debt. अब हम उसको किस तरह से पुश बैक कर सकते हैं, किस तरह से फाइट कर सकते हैं, उसमें फिर सेल्फ रिलायंस की बात आ जाती है.
ग्रेट. देखें, ये जो मॉडरेटर होता है ना, उसके पास बहुत पावर होती है. मैं बार बार पावर की बात करता हूँ. तो आवर टाइम इज़ अप. आई एम सॉरी. ऑन बिहाफ ऑफ बीकन हाउस, I thank Ambassador Mujtaba Paracha, Mr. Asim Chauhan, Dr. Hatia Majid, and Dr. Amar Malik, along with our audience, for participating in School of Tomorrow Edition 15, Guardians of the Future. Please share your feedback about this session through an email you will receive from the School of Tomorrow team. Thank you for your patience, for listening to us, and for being a wonderful audience.